Snow fell thick over the north shore that afternoon, blanketing the iron fences and marble archways of the lakeside estates along Lake Michigan, where wealth was locked away behind gates that ordinary people never dared to cross. On the white stone steps of one of the grandest mansions, a young woman was struggling to help an old lady climb, one step at a time. She was only 27, nearly 9 months pregnant, her thin maid's uniform soaked through with melted snow and clinging to her trembling back. The old woman on her shoulder was as light as a dry leaf at the end of its season, her feet dragging in torn shoes, and every breath she drew came broken, as though it might be her last. The young woman's name was Rosa. She did not know this old woman. Only hours before, she had been a stranger passing by, and she could have walked on the way hundreds of others had, but she did not. And now she stood before the door of a man whose name the entire city spoke only in whispers. The door swung open, but the one who stepped out was not the master of the house. It was another woman, resplendent in an emerald evening gown, diamonds glinting at her wrist, her hair falling in flawless waves as though she had just stepped away from a party. Her face, so favored by nature, was now twisted by something very ugly. She thrust out her hand to bar the way, as if driving off a stray animal. "Stop right there," she hissed, her eyes sweeping from Rosa's mud-stained shoes to the old woman's tattered coat. "Who do you think you are, dragging this filth onto my doorstep?" Behind her, the household staff stood frozen in the doorway, not one of them daring to move. Rosa tightened her arms around the old woman, feeling that frail body growing colder by the moment. Her voice shook, but her feet did not retreat a single step. "She's about to freeze to death out there," she said. "I'm only asking for a few minutes. Just call him down here once, just once." "Him?" The woman in the emerald gown laughed, a sound colder than the snow wind lashing across the porch. "Do you even know whose door you're standing at? Girl, get out of here, before I have you both dragged out like 2 sacks of trash." And in that very moment, when all hope seemed to have gone out, the old woman on Rosa's shoulder slowly lifted her head. Her eyes, clouded by years and hunger, opened toward the unfamiliar house. Her cracked lips moved, and from a chest nearly emptied of breath, she uttered a single sentence, only one, but enough to strike the arrogant woman silent, enough to make the whole magnificent mansion seem to stop beating. "Tell Salvatore," she whispered, "that his mother is still alive." Of all the names across this entire city, there was only one Salvatore that made people lower their voices, a man the police did not dare touch, before whom even the most powerful families bowed their heads. And this ragged, starving woman, dying on the shoulder of a stranger who happened to be a maid, had just called him her son. Rosa stood there, in the falling snow, one hand holding up the life of a woman she had never known, the other resting unconsciously on the curve of her own pregnant belly. She could not have known that her decision to stop and save a stranger that day was about to pull her and her unborn child into a storm that would tear open every secret buried behind these golden gates. And that, before it all was over, the story of 3 people abandoned by life would change forever what the word family was ever meant to mean. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next journey of healing. The snow continued to fall without pause upon the marble steps, as the old woman's words still hung suspended in the bitter air. And in that moment, the entire world seemed to stand still. The woman in the emerald gown, whose name was Camille, remained rooted where she stood, one hand still raised halfway, though not a trace of authority remained in it. The contemptuous smile on her face froze, and then disappeared, giving way to something paler than the snow itself. Just beyond the threshold, the servants remained motionless, but their silence had taken on a different meaning now. It was no longer the fear of their future mistress's fury, but the uneasy sense that something of enormous consequence had just been spoken before their very eyes. Rosa felt the change in the air, though she didn't understand why. She only knew that she tightened her arms around the frail body growing colder against her, praying that someone, anyone, would step forward and listen. Then, from somewhere deep within the mansion, beyond corridors lined with thick carpets, and beneath the glittering light of crystal chandeliers, the sound of footsteps began to echo. They weren't hurried, they weren't loud, they were simply steady and measured. Yet with every step, the servants pressed closer to the walls and lowered their heads, as though an invisible current of cold air were moving toward them. Camille spun around, and for the first time that afternoon, she was the one who stepped back. The man who emerged from the shadows of the corridor carried himself like someone who had never needed to raise his voice to make others obey. He was tall and powerfully built, dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit, his face sharply defined, his gray eyes as cold as a lake frozen in the heart of winter. He was Salvatore Brancato, and his presence alone seemed powerful enough to make the magnificent mansion shrink around him. He didn't look at Camille. He didn't look at the trembling servants. His gaze, sharp and detached as a blade, swept over Rosa without stopping, because to a man like him, a drenched housemaid standing at the threshold was no more significant than a shadow. His voice rose low and calm, frightening precisely because of its restraint, the voice of a man who had grown accustomed to watching the world turn according to his will. "What's happening here?" he asked. And though he spoke barely above a murmur, the entire space seemed to empty itself of air. Camille hurried toward him, her voice recovering some of its familiar sharpness, though confusion had begun to seep through it. "It's nothing, darling," she said. "Just some beggar who dragged herself here to cause trouble. I already told them to leave." But Salvatore didn't answer her. At that exact moment, the old woman in Rosa's arms stirred faintly, and her clouded eyes found the face of the man standing in the doorway. She stared at him intently, as though she were looking beyond the expensive suit, beyond the cold authority, searching for something that had been buried for far too long. Then, from her dry and cracked lips, another name escaped. It wasn't the name the entire city used when speaking of him in fear. It was something else, something gentle and weathered by time, a name only one person in the world had ever used for him. "My Sal," she whispered. "You've come home." The man who only moments earlier had made the entire mansion hold its breath suddenly went still. Those gray eyes, cold as ice, blinked once, then once again, and something began to fracture behind them, slowly, like a thick sheet of ice splitting beneath pressure rising from below. His expression changed. The detached calm vanished. He took one step forward, then stopped, as though he couldn't believe what his ears had just heard. "What did she say?" he asked, and this time, his voice no longer carried that frozen edge. It had turned rough and quiet, almost the whisper of the abandoned boy he had once been, left alone in the streets. Everyone in the room witnessed something none of them had ever imagined they would see. The formidable figure who had once commanded absolute fear across the entire city was now trembling before a ragged old woman lying in the arms of a housemaid he had never seen before. Camille's mouth fell open as she looked from her fiancé to the impoverished woman and then back again, struggling to piece together the fragments of a truth she was beginning to sense would overturn the flawless world she had worked so carefully to build. Rosa, still standing beneath the falling snow, felt the body in her arms grow faintly lighter, as though the burden of so many lonely years had finally been set down. The old woman smiled, a weak but complete smile, and tears rolled slowly across the face, deeply marked by time. "I've waited for you," she breathed. "I've always believed that one day you would find me." Salvatore took another step forward, and the hands that had once commanded an entire underworld empire now trembled slightly as he studied that face more closely, those eyes, and all the things that 15 years of separation had failed to erase. And in that very moment, while the snow continued to fall, and the entire world of power he had built seemed to dissolve around him, the coldest man in Chicago realized that the woman he had believed dead for so many years, the woman who had taken him in from the streets when he had been nothing at all, was truly lying there before him, and she was still alive. The legs of the most powerful man in Chicago gave way upon the marble threshold, and every trace of the majesty belonging to a man who stood at the very summit of power vanished. Salvatore dropped to his knees beside the old woman, heedless of the melting snow soaking into the finely tailored fabric of his trousers, heedless of the servants staring at him with wide and astonished eyes. He lifted a trembling hand and touched her deeply lined face, so gently that it seemed he feared even the slightest pressure might cause her to disappear like a dream he had kept buried for all those years. His fingertips followed the hollow curve of her cheekbone, then traced the small scar near the corner of her eyebrow that he still remembered, the scar she had gotten on a distant winter afternoon when she fell on an icy street while hurrying to bring him home. "Is it really you, Mother?" he breathed, and the voice of the man who had once made an entire city tremble shattered into the sob of a frightened child. "They told me you were gone. They told me you had been lying beneath the earth for years. I believed them. I believed it all this time." The old woman raised one skeletal hand, numb with cold, and placed it in his palm. Though her body had been exhausted to the very edge of endurance, her eyes still held the tender light that could belong only to a mother. "I never abandoned you," she said, her voice no louder than a breath. "Someone built a wall between us, and I wasn't strong enough to tear it down. Salvatore lowered his head and pressed his forehead against her hand for one long moment, and that magnificent mansion had never witnessed its master expose such profound weakness. Then he rose, and when he bent down and slipped his arms beneath her, lifting her from Rosa's embrace, he did so with the care of a man holding the most precious thing in the world. He cradled her against his chest, and her body was so frighteningly light that his heart tightened with pain. Then he began walking into the house, leaving wet footprints across the gleaming stone floor behind him. It was at that moment that Camille rushed forward and blocked his path, her beautiful face twisted with panic and outrage. "You can't be serious," she cried. "We have important guests arriving for dinner. Are you really going to let some filthy woman who reeks of the streets lie inside this house? Do you have any idea what people will say?" Salvatore stopped. He didn't turn around at once. He simply stood there for a moment with the old woman in his arms, and when he spoke, his voice had returned to its familiar coldness, that deep and quiet sound that everyone who had ever heard it understood allowed no argument. "This is my mother," he said, each word falling like a stone. "This woman took me in when I was nothing but an abandoned child thrown into the streets, and she'll remain in this house for as long as I'm breathing. If her presence makes you uncomfortable, the door will always be open for you to leave." Camille's face turned pale. Her lips moved as though she meant to protest, but no words came out, because she understood that the man standing before her wasn't the fiancé she could usually steer with tears or sweet words. This was another Salvatore, a man even she had never seen before. She stepped aside and allowed him to pass, and he walked by her as though she had never existed, carrying the old woman deeper into the mansion, while ordering the servants to prepare the warmest room in the house and summon the family physician at once. The air immediately filled with the sound of hurried footsteps. One servant ran to heat water, another rushed to find blankets and bedding, and every one of them bowed their heads and obeyed without daring to waste a single second. Amid all that frantic movement, however, one person was completely forgotten. Rosa remained standing at the threshold, her soaked maid's uniform clinging tightly to her skin, her arms now empty after the frail body she had struggled to support throughout the long journey had finally been returned to her son. No one looked back at her. No one asked who she was, why she had come, or what she had endured to bring the old woman all the way there. She stood alone, one hand unconsciously resting upon her pregnant belly as she felt the cold seeping deeper into her bones, and a familiar sorrow rose within her, the sorrow of someone who had always remained at the edge of everyone else's story. Then she looked toward the retreating figure of the man carrying his mother away, and she saw the tenderness hidden beneath his cold exterior. Something within her grew faintly warm. She had done the right thing. Even though no one had seen it, even though no one had thanked her, she had brought a mother home to her son, and perhaps, she told herself, that alone was worth everything she had suffered. She quietly turned away, intending to slip through the golden gates and disappear in silence, just as she had always quietly disappeared from everyone else's life. The family physician arrived within moments. An elderly man with silver hair and steady hands, summoned from the peace of his evening by a call he didn't dare delay answering. He bent beside the bed, listened to the old woman's faint heartbeat, examined her pallid skin and dry, cracked lips, then slowly shook his head with a grave expression. "Her body has been pushed to the very edge by hunger, thirst, and years of living in extreme hardship," he quietly told Salvatore. "She needs fluids, nourishment, attentive care, and above all, time. But her will is remarkably strong, and sometimes the will to live can accomplish things medicine can't explain." An intravenous line was quickly placed in her thin arm, and for the first time in all those long years, Maggie lay in a real bed, a soft bed with warm blankets drawn up to her shoulders, inside a room where heat from the fireplace drove away the bitter cold that had clung to her for so long. Salvatore pulled a chair close to the bedside and sat down, refusing to move even a single step away, his gray eyes following every breath his mother took, as though he feared that, if his attention faltered for even a moment, she would vanish from his life once again. Night descended beyond the windows while the snow continued falling in silence, and beneath the soft golden glow of the bedside lamp, the old woman began to speak, not in the form of one complete story, but through scattered fragments rising from her memory, sometimes clear and sometimes blurred. She spoke of rented rooms that grew smaller and more wretched with each passing year, places where she had been moved from one address to another. She spoke of winters spent shivering alone, telling herself that the little boy she had once raised must have grown into a good man by then, that he must have built a beautiful life somewhere far away, and that thought alone had been enough to keep her warm through the longest nights. She spoke of the tiny hope she had always carried within her, the belief that her son hadn't forgotten her, that something, some unseen power, had simply kept them apart. Salvatore listened in silence, tightening his hand around hers from time to time, and every word she spoke pierced his chest like a needle, because throughout all those years when he had lived, surrounded by wealth and power, the woman who had taken him in had endured things he couldn't bear to imagine. He said very little. He simply allowed the rare tears to roll down his face without wiping them away, because in his mother's presence, he was no longer the feared crime lord. He was only Sal, the abandoned child she had once found and given a home. At the far end of the room, hidden within the shadows where the lamplight couldn't reach, Rosa still lingered. She had meant to leave long ago. Several times, she had reached the doorway only to turn back, because something within her couldn't bear to abandon the old woman among people who were still strangers to her, even though one of them was her own son. But now, seeing Maggie receiving proper care and seeing her son seated faithfully beside her, Rosa believed her task was finished. She quietly turned away, pulled her thin, still damp coat more tightly around herself, and prepared to slip from the room as silently as she had entered their lives. But just as she lifted one foot, a skeletal hand suddenly reached from the bed and closed around her wrist with a strength no one would have expected from a body so thoroughly exhausted. "Don't go," Maggie whispered, her clouded eyes finding Rosa's face within the darkness. "You were the only one who stopped for me. In an entire city that turned its face away, you were the only one who bent down." Rosa froze, her throat tightening until she couldn't find the words to answer. Salvatore raised his head, and for the first time since emerging from the dark corridor, his gaze truly settled upon the young woman standing in the corner of the room. For the first time, he truly saw her. He saw the soaked maid's uniform, the stained shoes, the pregnant belly she was unconsciously supporting with one hand, and suddenly he understood something he had completely forgotten amid the shock of being reunited with his mother. This young woman, a complete stranger with no connection to any of them, had carried his mother across the frozen city and brought her home. "Stay," he said, and his voice no longer carried the icy authority he used when addressing those beneath him. There was something different in it now, something almost like a plea, awkwardly concealed behind his cold exterior. "I haven't thanked you yet, and my mother needs you beside her tonight." Rosa looked at the old woman's hand still wrapped tightly around her wrist, then at the pleading eyes of the elderly mother, and finally at the powerful man waiting for her answer. She gave a quiet nod, never knowing that this single gesture would completely change the rest of her life. By the time the night had grown deep and his mother's breathing had gradually settled into the steady rhythm of sleep, Salvatore still sat motionless beside her bed, and within that silence, his mind was drawn back to a distant winter afternoon he had believed he had buried forever. He remembered a thin little boy huddled in an alley behind the old market, a homeless child who hadn't eaten anything in 2 days, trembling against a freezing brick wall as he tried to hide from the wind that cut through his skin. That boy had learned how to become invisible. He had learned that people would step over him as though he were no more than a heap of garbage, and he no longer dared to look up and hope for anything from the hurried faces passing by. But that afternoon, a pair of worn shoes stopped in front of him. They belonged to a woman who was no longer young, wearing a faded coat and carrying a bag of bread she had bought with her last few coins. She bent down and looked at him, and instead of the pity or disgust he had grown so accustomed to seeing, her eyes held only one thing, a tenderness he had never known before. "You're very hungry, aren't you?" she asked, and without waiting for an answer, she lowered herself onto the filthy ground beside him, opened the bag, broke the loaf in half, and placed the larger piece into his numb hands. The boy devoured it, his tears mingling with the crumbs, while the woman watched him in silence with a sorrowful smile, denying herself the portion of bread that should have been hers. Then she raised a hand to her neck and removed a worn leather cord. Hanging from it was a small tin medallion, darkened by the passing years, engraved with the image of the patron saint of travelers. "This is Saint Christopher," she said, placing the medallion in his palm and folding his fingers around it. "People say he protects those who have lost their way, so they can always find the road home. I want you to keep it, so you'll know that no matter where you go, you'll never be alone again." She placed the cord around the boy's neck, and in that moment, the invisible child of the streets felt seen for the first time. He felt that someone believed he had value, that a stranger with no blood connection to him had opened her arms and accepted him. She took him back to her small, miserable room and called him her son. And from that moment on, his entire life changed. The memory faded when Salvatore blinked, pulling him back into the warm bedroom where the woman from all those years ago now lay asleep, her hair completely white, her face deeply carved by time and suffering. He lifted a hand to his chest, and through the fabric of his shirt, he felt the small, solid object that had always rested there, the St. Christopher medallion. He hadn't removed for even a single day, throughout all those years, the only thing that remained from that fateful afternoon in the old alley. He had become a powerful man and built an empire that commanded the fear and respect of the entire city, yet he had never once dared to take off that medallion, because it reminded him of who he truly was, of where he had begun, and of the only woman who had ever loved him without condition when he'd had nothing to offer in return. Now, as he watched her lying there, fragile and exhausted after so many years of abandonment while he had lived surrounded by wealth and luxury, an aching pain rose inside his chest, mingling boundless joy at having found his mother again, with relentless guilt for having allowed her to endure so much suffering. He gently took her hand, careful not to wake her, and within the still darkness of the room, he silently made a vow to himself, a vow no power on earth could ever shake. He would never allow anyone to separate them again. He would spend the rest of his life making amends for the years they had lost, and whoever had caused his mother such misery would pay the price. His gray eyes, softened moments earlier by love, now flashed with their familiar coldness, because he knew the events that had driven his mother to the brink of death couldn't have been mere coincidence, and he would uncover the truth hidden behind everything that had happened. The following morning, when the first rays of sunlight slipped through the window, and Maggie had regained a little strength from the intravenous fluids and a night of rest, she was finally lucid enough to tell her son the story she had carried in her heart for so many years. Salvatore sat on the edge of the bed, still holding his mother's hand, and listened with a patience few people had ever witnessed in a man like him. She began slowly, her voice still weak, yet every word was clear, as she spoke of the days after he had left their hometown and gone to the city to build a life for himself. "Do you remember Patrick?" she asked. "My brother-in-law, the husband of my late sister." Salvatore gave a slight nod. In his memory, Patrick Doyle had been an open-hearted, agreeable man whom he had respected as an elder of the family, someone to whom he had faithfully sent gifts on every holiday, someone he had trusted to care for his mother while he devoted himself to building his future far away. "He was the man you asked to look after me," Maggie continued, "and every month you sent him money for my care. I knew because, in the beginning, he used to tell me about it. He would boast that you had become successful, that you never forgot to send money home." But then her voice grew quieter, and her eyes drifted into the distance as though she were looking back upon all those bitter years. "That money never reached me," she whispered. "Patrick kept every cent. He used it to build a house for himself and expand his business, while he moved me from one room to another, each one smaller and more miserable than the last. At first, I was still living in the family property. Then he said he needed the space for something else, so he moved me into a cramped, rented room, and after that, into an even smaller one, until all I had left was a damp corner in a boarding house at the farthest edge of the city, where no one knew who I was." Salvatore's hand tightened around hers, the veins rising beneath the skin, but he forced himself to remain still so that his mother could continue. "The worst thing," Maggie said, and this time her voice trembled with pain, "was that he told you I was dead. He informed you and the rest of the family that I had died from an illness, so you would stop looking for me, so no one would question the money you kept sending home. And just like that, I became a dead woman while I was still struggling to stay alive." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I couldn't understand how anyone could be so cruel. I prayed every night. I kept wondering what sin I had committed to deserve such a fate. But then I realized that sometimes greed can strip a person of every last trace of humanity." Salvatore remained silent for a very long time after his mother finished speaking, and there was something within that silence far more terrifying than any thunderous outburst of rage. His expression didn't change. Not a single muscle in his face moved, yet his gray eyes had become two shards of ice, so cold and sharp that the sight of them could make anyone shudder. He had faced countless enemies within his underworld. He had witnessed every form of betrayal and cruelty, but nothing had ever struck him as deeply as the truth that the man he had trusted and respected had exploited his devotion as a son and used it to drive his mother into misery. "You should rest now," he finally said. His voice was gentle when he spoke to her, But beneath that tenderness lay something as hard as steel. "You don't need to worry about anything anymore. Leave the rest to me." He bent down and kissed her forehead, then rose and walked out of the room. The moment the door closed behind him, every trace of softness vanished from his face. He stood alone in the silent corridor and drew a deep breath, while only one name remained in his mind, tolling like a funeral bell. He would find Patrick Doyle, no matter where the man had hidden himself in this world, and he would force him to answer for every year of suffering he had inflicted upon Salvatore's mother. He took out his telephone, called his most trusted associate, and in a voice utterly cold and devoid of emotion, ordered his men to uncover every piece of information they could find about the whereabouts of the man who had dared deceive him for all those years. In the days that followed, Rosa was given a small room in the servants' quarters at the rear of the mansion, and her new responsibility was to care for Maggie at the old woman's own request. She carried out that duty with complete devotion, not because she was being paid generously, but because each time she looked into Maggie's deeply lined face, she caught a glimpse of another face, one she had tried to bury within her heart for so long. One afternoon, while Rosa was feeding her spoonfuls of porridge, Maggie gently asked about her life, and perhaps it was the tenderness in the old woman's eyes, or perhaps it had simply been too long since anyone had truly wanted to listen, but Rosa began to reveal things she had never told another soul. She said there had once been a time when she had dreams, when she had studied nursing with the hope of becoming a nurse, wearing a white uniform and caring for the sick. She had worked tirelessly, had ranked at the top of her class in her examinations, and the future had seemed to open before her like a bright road. But then her mother became ill, stricken by a terrible disease that demanded enormous hospital expenses a poor family like theirs could never afford. Rosa had been forced to set aside her unfinished degree and leave school to work, taking any job she could find, cleaning the homes of wealthy families and laboring from early morning until late at night, all to earn enough money to pay the mounting hospital bills. "I did everything I could," Rosa said, her voice tightening with emotion. "I sold everything that could be sold. I borrowed from everyone I knew. I begged, but in the end, it still wasn't enough, and my mother died in my arms, leaving behind an emptiness nothing could ever fill." Maggie reached out with one frail hand and took Rosa's, saying nothing, simply allowing her to continue, and within that warm clasp, Rosa found the comfort she had longed for over so many lonely years. She went on to speak of Danny, the man to whom she had given her heart when she had been adrift in grief after losing her mother. At first, he had been sweet and attentive. He had promised her a home and a future in which she would no longer have to struggle through life alone. But she hadn't seen his true nature until it was too late. She hadn't known that behind his polished charm was a gambling addict, a man willing to sacrifice everything at the gaming tables. He had borrowed money from everyone he could, taking on debts she knew nothing about, borrowing from loan sharks connected to one of the city's most notorious gangs. Then, on the day she told him she was carrying their child, instead of joy, she saw only panic on his face. A few days later, he disappeared without a word of farewell, leaving her alone with a growing baby and a mountain of debt that the collectors now placed entirely upon her shoulders. "I don't know what to do," Rosa whispered. "This baby is all I have left. It's the only light in my life, but it's also the reason I have to live in constant fear, always looking over my shoulder." When she finished, she lowered her head, both hands resting protectively over her pregnant belly, as though she could shield the tiny life within her from all the bitterness of the world. Maggie watched her for a long time, then gently drew her closer and embraced her with arms that were weak yet strangely warm. "My dear girl," she whispered, "you have far too kind a heart for this cruel world, and that is why you stopped for a helpless old woman while the entire city turned away." Rosa broke down in Maggie's arms, and in that moment, two strangers, one old and one young, both abandoned by life in different ways, found in each other the love they had both lost. To Rosa, holding Maggie felt like holding the mother she had lost forever, and she silently promised herself that no matter what happened, she would never abandon this old woman. While the bond between Rosa and Maggie grew stronger with each passing day, in another wing of the mansion, a silent storm was beginning to gather beneath Camille's magnificent appearance. She couldn't bear the presence of the impoverished old woman inside the house she regarded as her own private kingdom, and she couldn't accept the thought that this raggedly dressed woman was now being treasured like something precious by her powerful fiancé. Camille stood before the large mirror in her private room, studying the flawless reflection staring back at her, while her mind filled with dark visions of everything that might go wrong. Her marriage to Salvatore Brancato wasn't merely a matter of love. It was an event eagerly anticipated by the highest circles of society throughout the city, a union between two names of extraordinary power, and she had devoted more effort than anyone could imagine to creating the image of herself as the perfect woman, worthy of standing beside a man like him. Now, the sudden arrival of a future mother-in-law who had emerged from the slums, a rough-spoken woman with calloused hands, threatened to destroy everything Camille had so carefully built. She imagined the searching looks of her wealthy friends, the whispers behind her back at elegant parties, the intrusive questions she would be forced to avoid, and the thought alone was enough to make her tremble with fury. But Camille's fear went far beyond appearances, and that was the truth she concealed even from herself. That afternoon, her father, Roland Ashford, one of the most experienced and dangerous financial magnates in the city, had summoned her to speak with him privately in his office. Seated behind an enormous oak desk, a cigar held between two fingers, he studied his daughter with the cold gaze of a man who measured every human being solely by their usefulness. "This marriage must proceed exactly as planned," he said, his voice low and calculating. "Do you understand how important it is?" Ashford then explained something he had never spoken so openly before. The empire Salvatore had built was a rich prize he had coveted for years, and only after the marriage was complete, only after the two families had become one, would he be able to begin placing his own people inside Salvatore's organization, manipulating its business relationships, and eventually swallowing everything Salvatore controlled. "You're my piece on the board in this game," he told her bluntly, "and I won't allow anything to ruin it." It was then that Camille let slip the news of the old woman's arrival, and she saw her father's expression darken immediately. "A mother?" Ashford murmured. "That isn't good at all." He rose from his chair and walked to the window, and with the cold mind of a man who had spent his life calculating every possible outcome, he immediately recognized the danger concealed within what might otherwise have seemed like a harmless reunion. A man as cold as Salvatore, once he has found the mother he believed he had lost, will begin to soften, he said. He'll start caring about things other than power and money. He'll have a weakness. And once his heart begins to change, he may decide he no longer needs this marriage. Or worse, he'll become more cautious and harder to control than ever before. He turned and looked at his daughter, a sinister light gleaming in his eyes. "That old woman must disappear from his life," he said. "But not through anything crude. You must make him drive her away with his own hands. You must make him lose faith in her. You understand what I mean, don't you?" Camille left her father's office in an entirely different state of mind. Her jealousy and irritation had now been strengthened by a motive far colder and more dangerous. She no longer wanted to remove the old woman merely to protect her reputation. She understood that this was a task, a move in the greater game being played by her family, and that if she failed, she would lose everything as well. When she returned to the mansion, she sat alone in the darkness, her long, slender fingers tapping lightly against the arm of her chair, and within her sharp, calculating mind, she began carefully arranging each step of a plan she knew would have to be extraordinarily subtle. The old woman couldn't simply vanish. She had to become something suspicious in Salvatore's eyes, a threat, a liar, and Camille smiled coldly as the first pieces of her conspiracy began to take shape within her mind. At the same time, on another level of the empire Salvatore ruled, a different problem was waiting for him, and it revealed the man the entire city feared whenever he stepped into the heart of his own domain. In a sealed room buried deep beneath a building owned by the organization, a sickly yellow light fell upon a man hunched in a chair at the center of the room, sweat pouring down his face despite the bitter winter cold. His name was Vince, a longtime member whom Salvatore had once trusted with managing part of the organization's business interests, but his men had recently discovered that Vince had been secretly passing information to outsiders in exchange for hidden payments. Salvatore entered the room without hurry, his hands resting in his trouser pockets, and the manner of his arrival alone seemed to make the air solidify. He didn't shout, he didn't strike the table, he showed no outward sign of anger, because those who truly possessed power never needed noisy displays. He pulled a chair across from Vince and sat down, his cold gray eyes fixed directly upon the traitor with a calmness more terrifying than any outburst of fury. "I gave you a home when you had nothing," he said quietly. "I trusted you, and you know that in our world, trust is the most valuable thing we possess, and also the easiest thing to break." Vince stammered out pleas for mercy, swearing that he had been foolish only once and begging to be forgiven, but Salvatore merely raised one hand, and the man fell silent at once. He didn't need excuses. He needed only one answer to one question, and in that even, icy voice, he asked who had paid for the information. It was then, with nowhere left to turn, that Vince revealed something that caused Salvatore's eyes to narrow slightly. He said that strangers had recently approached him, men who hadn't only asked about the organization's business dealings, but had also been searching for information about something else. An elderly woman who had recently appeared at Salvatore's mansion, who she was, and what relationship she had to him. They paid very well for information about her, Vince said, trembling. I swear I don't know who they are. They were very secretive, but they had money, a great deal of money, and they were especially interested in that woman. At those words, a chill ran along Salvatore's spine, because they confirmed a suspicion he had already begun to feel, that his mother's appearance wasn't merely a reunion, but something that had drawn the attention of an unseen force hiding in the shadows. He sat in silence for a moment, and in that instant, an old image flashed through his mind, the image of the thin boy he had once been, shivering in a frozen alley, the boy who had learned that in this merciless world, anyone who revealed a weakness would be crushed. He had shaped himself into a man without weaknesses, and now that he had finally recovered the most precious person in his life, someone was watching that very weakness. He rose to his feet, looked down at Vince, and delivered his judgment without the slightest hesitation. I won't take your life, he said, because you're not worth that much of my attention. But from this moment forward, you have nothing left in this city. Everything you gained under my protection will be taken from you, and you have one night to leave Chicago forever. If I see your face in this city again, or if I discover that you've spoken even half a word to anyone, then my promise to spare your life will no longer stand. Vince nodded frantically, tears streaming down his face in relief at being allowed to live, and Salvatore's men dragged him away while Salvatore turned and left the room without looking back. But as he walked along the dark corridor, his thoughts weren't on the traitor he had just exiled. They circled only around the words Vince had spoken, about the strangers quietly searching for information about his mother, and Salvatore knew he had to find them before they had the chance to act. Camille wasn't someone who acted hastily, and she understood that to bring down a man as sharp as Salvatore, she would have to strike at the exact place where he was most vulnerable. Not his heart, but the suspicion deeply rooted in the instincts of a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by betrayal. She knew that his fear of treachery from within was the one thing capable of shaking him, and she had quietly prepared this attack with the meticulous care of someone whose every move was calculated. She sought out a man who specialized in carrying out shadowy work, someone skilled at fabricating sound and images so convincingly that almost no one could tell they were false, and she paid him to create a recording along with several carefully manipulated photographs. In the recording, a hoarse, elderly woman's voice could be heard whispering information to someone, mentioning Salvatore's business dealings, sensitive figures, and important names, as though she were secretly reporting to an outside force. The photographs showed the bent figure of an old woman meeting an unfamiliar man on a secluded street corner. The images blurred just enough to allow anyone looking at them to fill in the missing details with their own suspicion. Camille knew perfectly well about the strangers asking questions about the old woman, because her father was the one orchestrating everything, and she cleverly used that half-truth to construct a perfect trap, arranging every clue so that it pointed toward the conclusion that Maggie herself was the informant planted by an enemy to extract information from her own son. She chose the moment when Salvatore was already under the greatest strain from the revelation that strangers had been investigating his mother, and one evening, she approached him wearing the anxious and hesitant expression of a worried fiancé, as though she were forcing herself to do something unbearably difficult. I don't know whether I should show you this, she said. Her trembling voice performed with flawless precision. I've thought about it for a long time because I know it'll hurt you, but I can't remain silent when I believe you may be in danger. She handed him the recording and the photographs, then stepped back and watched his reaction, her eyes carefully concealed behind an expression of sorrow. Salvatore took them, and when the fabricated sounds began to play, when the hazy images appeared before him, something tightened inside his chest. He had lived his entire life by the rule that no one should ever be trusted completely. He had seen too many people wear the mask of loyalty only to drive a knife into someone's back, and now, at the very moment when he had finally opened his heart to accept someone, that suspicion rose again like a sleeping beast suddenly awakened. He didn't want to believe it. His entire heart cried out that it couldn't be true, that the woman who had once given him the last piece of bread she possessed could never be a liar. But the cold mind hardened by years in the underworld whispered poisonous questions into his ear. Why had his mother appeared at such a sensitive time? How could he be certain that all those years apart hadn't changed her into someone else? Was he allowing emotion to cloud his judgment? His face darkened, his fingers tightening around the photographs, and Camille knew she had successfully planted the seed of doubt in his mind. "This is only what happened to come into my possession," she continued, feeding the flame she had just ignited. "I'm not claiming that any of it is true, but you've always taught me that in your world, nothing happens by coincidence." Salvatore didn't answer. He simply rose and walked out of the room with heavy steps, and for the first time since finding his mother again, he felt an invisible distance beginning to creep between them, a fragile crack deliberately opened by an enemy hiding in the shadows. He couldn't sleep that night. The image of his gentle mother and the false voices on the recording took turns tearing through his mind, and with growing horror, he realized that the greatest fear of his life was being used against him by an unseen hand. Life within the mansion continued according to its own quiet rhythms, and Rosa gradually grew familiar with the long corridors, the vast rooms, and the constantly hurried faces of the servants. Among them was a young man named Aaron, an accountant who worked for the family, someone who always appeared tired and anxious, forever bent over stacks of ledgers, and rarely speaking to anyone. Rosa noticed him not because there was anything remarkable about him, but because she recognized in his eyes a familiar sadness, the look of someone carrying a burden they couldn't share with another soul. One afternoon, as she passed the small room where he worked while bringing tea to Maggie, she heard him whispering urgently into the telephone, his voice filled with panic and despair. He was speaking about his younger sister, about her persistent fevers, about not knowing what to do and not having enough money to take her to a decent hospital. When he ended the call and looked up to find Rosa standing there, embarrassment and shame briefly crossed his face, but she merely offered him a gentle smile and set the cup of tea down. "I didn't mean to overhear," she said softly, "but perhaps I can help in some small way, if you don't mind." Aaron looked at her with doubt, wondering what a pregnant maid could possibly do for him, but there was something in the sincerity of her eyes that made him open his heart. He told her that his little sister had been ill for a long time, that their parents had died, and he was the only person she could depend on, that he had tried everything he could think of, but the medical expenses kept piling up until he was nearly exhausted. Rosa listened with deep compassion, because she understood all too well the helplessness of watching someone you loved suffer while being unable to do anything. She told him that she had once studied nursing, and although she hadn't completed her degree, she still possessed knowledge that might be useful. Patiently, she taught him how to care for his sister at home, how to bring down a fever properly, how to watch for dangerous symptoms that required immediate medical attention, and how to prepare suitable meals to strengthen a body weakened by illness. She also told him where struggling families could seek medical assistance, information she had learned during the most desperate years of caring for her own mother. Aaron listened to every word as though clinging to a lifeline, and when she finished, tears stood in his eyes. "You have no idea how much you've just helped me," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's been so long since anyone truly cared about what I was going through." Rosa only shook her head and said it was nothing remarkable, that anyone in her position would have done the same. But to Aaron, that small act of kindness became a rare warmth shining through the darkest days of his life. She had no idea that the goodness she had planted so freely would one day take root and blossom at a time she could never have imagined. Meanwhile, the bond between Rosa and Maggie deepened with every passing day. Each morning, Rosa came to Maggie's bedside, helped brush her silver hair, and told her little stories to lift her spirits. Each evening, she remained beside her until she drifted into sleep. Maggie, in turn, regarded Rosa as the daughter she had never had. She worried about Rosa's health and the baby growing inside her, reminded her to eat properly and rest, and whenever she saw Rosa working too hard, she scolded her in the voice of a mother. Two people who had once been abandoned by life had now found in each other the home they had both believed lost forever. And within that magnificent but cold mansion, Maggie's small room became the only place truly filled with the warmth of genuine love. Rosa often told herself that no matter what the future brought, no matter whether the debt collectors outside eventually found her, no matter whether her child would be born into a world filled with uncertainty, at least in this moment, she was no longer alone, and that alone was enough to give her the strength to keep moving forward. The investigative machinery Salvatore set in motion never operated carelessly, and within only a few days, his men had traced the whereabouts of the man he was hunting. Patrick Doyle hadn't vanished from the face of the earth as he had imagined. He had merely moved to a town far from the city, disguising himself as a respectable businessman and enjoying a comfortable life built upon the money he had stolen. The dossier placed on Salvatore's desk contained every detail about where Patrick lived, whom he associated with, and everything he currently owned. And as Salvatore turned each page, his gray eyes grew colder. But he didn't move against him at once, because Salvatore was a man who calculated every step, and he wanted the traitor to taste fear before being forced to face the true price of what he had done. He ordered his men to approach quietly, leaving behind vague signs that were just clear enough for Patrick to understand that his secret had been exposed, that the wall of lies he had built over so many years had finally collapsed, and that the man he had once deceived now knew everything. The strategy worked even faster than Salvatore had expected. In the place where he had been hiding, Patrick Doyle realized that his peaceful days were over. He knew exactly who Salvatore was, knew exactly what that man was capable of, and the terror of approaching revenge left him unable to eat or sleep, making him start violently at every unfamiliar sound. He understood that with his own strength alone, he could never survive the fury of an underworld empire, and in desperation, he began searching for a lifeline, for a power strong enough to protect him from Salvatore's reach. And fate, or more precisely, the cruel design of hidden conspiracies, led him to one particular name. Through the tangled connections of the shadowy business world, Patrick heard whispers that a powerful figure was plotting against Salvatore Brancato, a seasoned financial magnate named Roland Ashford. Like a drowning man grasping at anything within reach, Patrick used every means available to contact him and beg for protection, willing to surrender anything in exchange for his own safety. As for Ashford, when his men first informed him that someone terrified of Salvatore was seeking his protection, he showed little interest, until he learned the man's true identity. The moment he realized that Patrick Doyle was the one who knew every hidden corner of the old woman's past, the very man who had created the tragedy that had consumed Salvatore's mother, a calculating light appeared in Ashford's experienced eyes, because he immediately recognized the value of this desperate man. Someone like Patrick, someone who knew every detail of Maggie's past, would be an invaluable piece in the plan he and his daughter were secretly carrying out. Ashford summoned Patrick to meet him, and as he sat across from the man trembling with fear, he smiled the cold smile of a hunter who had just found the perfect prey. "I can protect you from Salvatore," he said in a smooth voice filled with authority. "I have enough power to keep him from reaching you, but in return, you'll do something for me, and you'll do it exactly as I instruct." Patrick, with nowhere left to turn and completely ruled by fear, nodded his agreement before he even knew what he would be asked to do. And just like that, two conspiracies that had once seemed entirely separate, one driven by the Ashford family's ambition to seize Salvatore's empire, the other born from the past crimes of a man who had deceived an entire family, now merged into one, intertwining into a dangerous web, quietly tightening around Salvatore and the people he loved. No one inside the mansion, not even Salvatore with all his sharp instincts, could have imagined that the man he was hunting and the man secretly directing the plot against him had now become allies, united by a common purpose, and that the true storm had only just begun to gather. The storm Ashford had been quietly preparing chose the most dangerous possible moment to strike. In those days, Salvatore stood on the threshold of one of the most important deals of his career, a partnership with a powerful international investor named Halloran, who had flown across the ocean to Chicago to sign the contract. Both sides had spent nearly an entire year negotiating. This was the turning point that would carry Salvatore's empire onto the international stage, and he understood that even the smallest mistake could cause everything to collapse. Ashford, with the seasoned cunning of a patient hunter, had waited for precisely this fragile moment to launch his attack. In the middle of the crucial meeting, while Salvatore was receiving his distinguished guest in his formal office, Ashford arranged for the poisonous information to be delivered directly into Halloran's hands. He had someone present a carefully fabricated dossier containing a statement from Patrick Doyle, who posed as a credible witness, claiming to be a relative of the family and accusing them of having staged the entire story of the long-lost mother. According to his smooth and calculated lies, the old woman wasn't Salvatore's mother at all, but an imposter hired to take part in an elaborate blackmail scheme targeting the crime lord's enormous fortune. More dangerously, the statement was accompanied by a stack of falsified financial records, reports suggesting that suspicious funds were being withdrawn from the family's accounts, with questionable expenses deliberately linked to the old woman's arrival. as though an entire operation were using her to drain the family's wealth. The documents had been forged so skillfully that almost no one would have thought to question them, because they had been created by Aaron himself, the young accountant whom Ashford had driven into a corner and forced to take part in the crime by exploiting his desperation over the money needed for his sister's medical treatment. When the documents were placed before him, the expression on Halloran's face changed immediately. As a man who had spent his entire life surviving the merciless world of finance, he understood all too well that instability within a family was often a sign of deeper fractures inside an entire empire. "I came here to invest in strength and credibility," he said, in a carefully measured voice, "not to become involved in a scandal that could destroy my reputation. I don't need to know whether these accusations are true. The fact that they exist is enough to make me reconsider." Salvatore felt as though the ground beneath his feet were beginning to split apart. Nearly a year of effort now stood on the verge of dissolving into nothing within a single moment. And what wounded him most wasn't the threatened deal, but the fact that his enemy had once again turned his own mother into a weapon against him. He struggled to maintain his outward composure, assuring Halloran that the accusations were nothing more than blatant slander spread by jealous enemies. But his distinguished guest remained unmoved. Halloran rose, fastened the button of his suit jacket, and delivered his ultimatum in a voice that was cold but decisive. "I'll give you exactly 2 weeks," he said. 2 weeks to prove that these allegations are fabricated and that your family is innocent. Otherwise, I'll withdraw from this agreement and take my investment elsewhere." The words hung over Salvatore like a suspended sentence, because that brief deadline didn't merely threaten a contract. It threatened the thousands of people whose lives depended upon the stability of the empire he had built. After Halloran departed, Salvatore remained alone in the vast office, which had suddenly become suffocating, while the forged documents lay upon his desk like a silent mockery. For the first time in many years, he tasted the bitterness of helplessness, as his enemy struck the one place he had never known how to defend, the very bond of love he had only just recovered. The pressure of that merciless deadline weighed heavily upon Salvatore's shoulders, and in the depths of his exhaustion, the seeds of doubt Camille had so skillfully planted within him began to rise more powerfully than ever. He had always been a man accustomed to analyzing everything with cold reason, and now, surrounded by fabricated evidence and poisonous accusations, a dark corner of his mind kept gnawing at him with cruel questions. Had he opened his heart too quickly? Had all those years apart transformed the mother in his memories into someone he no longer truly understood? Could all those tears and moving stories have been nothing more than an elaborate performance? Torn between love and suspicion, he finally went to Maggie's room, and although he tried to restrain himself, his voice couldn't hide the pain within him when he spoke. "Mother," he said, his gray eyes fixed upon her as though he were trying to see into the deepest part of her soul, "I need you to tell me the truth. Are you hiding anything from me? Has anyone approached you? Has anyone asked you to do something for them?" Maggie looked up at her son, and when she understood the meaning concealed beneath those questions, when she realized that the child she had always loved was now doubting her, a profound wound appeared in her aged eyes. She didn't grow angry. She didn't reproach him. She only looked at him with the sorrow of a mother watching her son become surrounded by darkness. "My son," she said softly, her voice trembling yet filled with tenderness. "I've lived an entire lifetime with empty hands. I've never possessed anything except the love I carry for you. And if even that is something you now doubt, then I don't know how I can prove myself to you. All I can tell you is that this heart has never wanted anything from you except to see you alive and safe." Her words cut into Salvatore like a knife, but the suspicion buried deep within him still wouldn't release its grip, and he left her room more troubled than before. That night, he sat alone in his office. The forged records spread beneath the lamplight before him, and he stared endlessly at the handwriting supposedly belonging to his mother, the unsteady and awkward script of an elderly woman. Then, in a sudden moment, a thought flashed through his mind, and he rose and walked toward the cabinet where he kept the most private keepsakes of his life. He searched for a long time before finally taking out a birthday card yellowed by the passing years, a card Maggie had written to him when he was still a boy, something he had treasured and protected for all those years as though it were priceless. He opened the card and placed it beneath the light beside the forged documents, comparing every letter, one by one. The longer he looked, the faster his heart began to beat, because the differences became so clear that they couldn't be denied. The handwriting on the old card, though simple and untrained, possessed a character of its own, soft curves and familiar strokes that could only have come from his mother's hand. The writing on the documents, however, despite every attempt to imitate her style, revealed the stiffness and distortion of an imposter, sharp and lifeless lines, details exaggerated with clumsy effort. This wasn't his mother's handwriting. The realization struck Salvatore so forcefully that he dropped back into his chair, and a wave of relief and shame surged through him at once. He had almost allowed his enemies to lead him by the hand. He had nearly betrayed the very woman who had loved him without condition. And now he understood that every piece of evidence against his mother had been fabricated. His anger was no longer directed toward Maggie. It turned completely toward the people who had built this elaborate deception. And for the first time, after days of confusion, his gray eyes once again carried the cold, piercing light of a hunter who had caught the scent of his prey. He knew he had been dealt a painful blow, and he swore that he would uncover the conspiracy at its very roots and drag every hidden face out of the darkness. But fate seemed unwilling to grant that mansion even a single moment of peace, because just as Salvatore had begun to uncover the truth behind the plot against his mother, another danger came looming from a direction no one had expected. The debt Danny had left behind for Rosa refused to remain buried in the darkness, and after many days of following her trail, the loan sharks connected to that notorious gang finally discovered where she was staying. They didn't know, or perhaps greed had blinded them to every trace of caution, that the young woman they were hunting now lived beneath the roof of one of the most powerful men in the city. On a gray afternoon, a group of brutal men recklessly forced their way through the gates, taking advantage of a brief lapse in security, and stormed onto the mansion grounds with murder in their eyes. They shouted Rosa's name, pounded violently on the doors, and demanded that she repay the money her faithless ex-partner had borrowed, their uproar shaking the entire house. The moment Rosa heard those voices, all color drained from her face, and her whole body began to tremble, because she knew exactly who those men were and what they were capable of doing. Instinctively, she stepped backward, wrapping both arms tightly around her pregnant belly as she tried to shield the small life within her, while the men advanced closer with every passing second, hurling crude threats at her. It was in the middle of that chaos that Salvatore appeared. He stepped out of the mansion, and his presence alone seemed to freeze the air. He wasn't hurried, he didn't lose control. He simply walked slowly into the center of the disturbance, his gray eyes sweeping across each face with a coldness that made even the most aggressive among them hesitate. "Do you know where you're standing?" he asked, his voice low but sharp as a blade, and one of the men began to turn pale the moment he recognized Salvatore's face. But the leader, still swollen with arrogance, pushed forward and declared that the woman owed them money, that they had every right to collect it, and that no one could stop them. It was the greatest mistake he had ever made. Salvatore's men moved at once, and a brief confrontation erupted, but it ended almost as quickly as it had begun, because the debt collectors were no match for the men who served the crime lord. They were swiftly overpowered and driven into a corner, and the leader who had been so defiant only moments earlier was now forced down, every trace of arrogance gone, leaving only naked terror across his face. Salvatore walked toward him, bent down, and spoke in that steady voice more frightening than any shout. "This woman is under my protection," he said, "and whatever debt you believe she owes no longer exists from this moment forward. If I see any of you come near her again, or if I hear her name leave your mouths one more time, you'll understand why this entire city lowers its voice whenever it speaks mine." He gave a signal, and his men threw the debt collectors out through the gates, casting them back into the dark world from which they had crawled. When everything finally grew quiet, Salvatore turned toward Rosa, who was still pressed against the wall, her eyes glistening with tears, and both hands wrapped protectively around her belly. In that moment, as he saw the fear and loneliness etched across her face, something within him shifted. He saw in her the image of the boy he had once been, a soul abandoned by life, hunted and left without anyone to protect him, someone forced to stand against the entire world without a single place of refuge. "You don't need to be afraid anymore," he said, and this time his voice had softened considerably. "As long as you remain beneath this roof, no one will harm you or your child." Rosa lifted her eyes to his, and within those gray eyes that had always seemed so cold, she found an unexpected trace of warmth, a silent understanding passing between two people who had both once been rejected by the world. She nodded faintly as the last tears rolled down her cheeks, no longer because she was frightened, but because for the first time after so many days spent running, she finally felt truly safe. But that peace lasted only a short while, because the fact that the debt collectors had dared to violate his territory was an insult Salvatore couldn't overlook, and he knew that to fully protect Rosa as well as his own honor, he had to pursue the matter all the way to the lair of the gang, bold enough to challenge him. That night, as a violent snowstorm began sweeping across the city, burying every road beneath white drifts and drawing a thick curtain over all of Chicago, Salvatore set out with nearly all of his men, committing his full strength to eliminating the threat once and for all. The vast mansion suddenly became strangely deserted, with only a few servants, Maggie and Rosa, remaining inside. The storm grew more ferocious with every passing hour, the wind howling against the windows while the snow piled so high outside that every route was blocked, leaving the entire city frozen and completely isolated. It was on that fateful night, while the world beyond the walls disappeared into the storm, that Rosa suddenly felt powerful cramps twisting through her body, and with horror, she realized that the baby inside her was demanding to be born earlier than expected. She cried out for help, and the terrible news quickly spread that there was no possible way to take her to the hospital because every road had been buried beneath the snow, and no ambulance could reach them in time through the raging blizzard. Fear filled the room. The servants stumbled about in confusion, not knowing what to do, while Rosa, alone and in agony, felt as though every hope she possessed were slipping beyond her reach. But at that very moment, Maggie stepped forward. The elderly woman, who had still seemed so frail, suddenly became remarkably steady, her eyes shining with the calm of someone who had faced moments of life and death before. In the distant village where she had grown up, she had helped deliver more women than she could count, and welcomed countless new lives into the world with those very hands. And now, when there was no one else they could depend upon, she knew she had to become the source of strength for the daughter she had come to love. "Look at me, my child. Look into my eyes," she told Rosa in a voice that was gentle yet firm. "You aren't alone. I've done this many times before. You only need to trust me and follow my instructions. We'll get through this together." She directed the servants to prepare warm water and clean towels, held Rosa's hand, guided her through each breath and each effort, and continued calling out warm words of encouragement without pause. Meanwhile, in another part of the frozen city, Salvatore and his men were confronting the rival gang amid the blinding snow, facing a tense struggle in which he used both his authority and his sharp judgment to intimidate them and force them into complete submission, bringing the threat against the young woman waiting at home to a permanent end. Two scenes unfolded beneath the same storm-filled sky, one with a man fighting to protect, the other with women fighting to welcome a new life into the world, and both were illuminated by the same force, the love they carried for one another. Time seemed to stop inside that warm room, and then, after one final effort, amid the roar of the wind outside, the cry of a newborn child rang out, clear and strong, tearing through the tension and bringing an overwhelming burst of joy. The baby had arrived safely, and Maggie, her hands trembling with emotion, gently lifted the tiny child, cleaned the newborn, and wrapped the little body in a soft, warm cloth before placing the baby in the arms of the exhausted mother, whose heart was overflowing with happiness. Rosa looked down at the tiny face of her child, the child she had protected alone through so many storms, and tears of joy rolled freely down her cheeks. "You did it, my daughter," Maggie whispered, wiping the tears from her own face. "You brought a miracle into this world." Inside that small room filled with warmth on the coldest winter night, 3 generations, an old woman who had once been abandoned, a young mother who had once been rejected, and a newborn child opening its eyes to the world, held one another close, and for the first time in her sorrowful life, Rosa fully understood the meaning of family. But the joy was painfully brief, because that storm-filled night had drained the last remnants of strength from Maggie's aging body. She had poured every measure of her will and vitality into bringing the baby safely into the world, and once everything was over, once she had placed the tiny child in the mother's arms, her body, already weakened by so many years of hardship, seemed to collapse completely. The following morning, when Salvatore returned after putting an end to the threat beyond the mansion walls, he entered the house with relief in his heart and a quiet eagerness to tell his mother that he had protected Rosa. But what awaited him was a sight that made his heart seem to stop. Maggie lay motionless upon the bed, her face frighteningly pale, her breathing as fragile as a candle about to die in the wind. The physician was summoned immediately, but after examining her, he could only shake his head with a heavy expression and explain that her body had struggled for too long against too much suffering, that she had given away the last of what she possessed, and that all they could do now was pray and remain beside her. At those words, Salvatore felt the entire world of power he had spent his life building become meaningless, because all his money and influence couldn't purchase the fading life of the only woman who had ever loved him without condition. He walked to the bedside and fell to his knees, the hands that had once made an entire city tremble now shaking as they closed around his mother's thin, cold hand. And then the man who had never allowed anyone to witness his weakness began to weep. The tears he had restrained for an entire lifetime poured freely from his eyes, beyond his power to stop them, and between broken sobs, he confessed everything he had carried inside his heart. "Mother, please don't leave me," he said, his voice shattered. "I wandered too far. I allowed power and money to turn me into a man even you might no longer recognize. I built walls around my heart so high that I forgot what it felt like to be loved. I became cold and merciless because I was afraid. I was afraid of being weak. I was afraid of being abandoned once again, like the little boy you once found in the streets. And that fear nearly made me betray you. It made me doubt the mother who gave me her last piece of bread when I was nothing." He lowered his head against her hand, his tears soaking into her wrinkled skin, and continued whispering his remorse from the deepest place within him. "You taught me that no matter where I went, I would always find my way home," he said, remembering the promise she had given him so many years before. "But I lost myself for far too long. I forgot the way back. And now that I've only just found you again, I can't bear the thought of losing you a second time. Please stay. Give me the chance to begin again, to become the son you always hoped I would be, and to repay you for all the years when I wasn't by your side." Inside the silent room, where only his broken sobs and her faint breathing could be heard, time seemed to stop. Rosa stood quietly in one corner, holding her newborn child in her arms, and watching with tears streaming down her face, because she understood better than anyone the agony of being about to lose a mother. Then, as the first rays of dawn began to slip through the window and drive away the darkness left behind by the storm, Maggie's hand stirred faintly within his. Her aged eyes slowly opened, and despite her weakness, she still recognized the son kneeling and weeping beside her. "Don't cry any more, my son," she whispered, a faint smile appearing upon her lips. "I'm still here, and I haven't gone anywhere." At the sound of his mother's voice, Salvatore lifted his head sharply, and in that moment, beneath the rising light of dawn, a fragile but comforting ray of hope began to shine within the tear-filled eyes of the man whom nothing had ever seemed capable of breaking. As Maggie's health gradually stabilized over the days that followed, and as the fear of losing his mother loosened its grip on Salvatore's heart, he never forgot that the investor's merciless deadline still hung over him, and that he needed evidence powerful enough to overturn the entire game his enemies had arranged. One quiet evening, while he sat beside his mother's bed, his hand moved by habit toward the St. Christopher medallion hanging around his neck, the keepsake he hadn't parted with for so many years. He lifted it and slowly turned it between his fingers beneath the gentle lamplight, and in that unexpected moment, his gaze settled upon the back of the medallion. Since childhood, he had assumed those faint, worn markings were merely decorative patterns faded by age, but examining the medallion closely under the strong light, he noticed for the first time that the microscopic lines formed a precise sequence. They had been arranged in a strange and deliberate order, and as his eyes followed them carefully, his heart began to beat faster when he understood that they were actually a sequence of numbers and letters engraved with painstaking precision. He turned toward his mother, and his voice filled with confusion, asked her what the symbols meant. Maggie looked at the medallion in her son's hand, and a faintly sorrowful smile appeared upon her face, as though she were remembering something she had kept hidden for a very long time. "I've often wondered whether you would ever notice them," she said softly. "I carved them there many years ago, when I realized I was being driven into a place from which there might be no escape." She explained that when she first began to sense danger closing around her, when she slowly understood that someone was trying to steal what belonged to her son and force her into misery, she had secretly gathered everything that might serve as evidence, papers and documents, proving the truth of how the property and money had been taken. "I knew that a poor old woman like me could never stand alone against people with wealth and power," she said. "But I still held on to the belief that one day I would see you again, and when that day came, I wanted you to have everything you needed to demand justice." She told him that she had placed all the evidence inside a safe deposit box at a bank, somewhere no one else could reach, and that the sequence engraved on the back of the medallion was the code to that box. "I carved it onto the one thing I knew you would always carry with you," she said, "so that no matter what happened to me, the key to the truth would always rest directly over your heart." Salvatore sat in stunned silence, his entire body seeming to freeze as the realization overwhelmed him, because throughout all those years, The one thing capable of exposing every crime and saving everything had remained beside him, hanging around his neck, touching his skin each day without his ever knowing. The keepsake he had always treasured as a symbol of love had now become a golden key capable of opening the door to justice. Early the next morning, he went directly to the bank, and with that sequence of numbers and letters, he opened the safe deposit box in which his mother had placed so much hope. Inside was an entire collection of carefully organized records, clear and undeniable evidence of the complete truth. Documents powerful enough not only to clear his mother's name of every false accusation, but also to expose the crimes that had remained hidden for so long. Holding the file in his hands, Salvatore's gray eyes gleamed with a cold yet unwavering determination, because the balance had now shifted entirely in his favor. He didn't merely possess the evidence needed to save the agreement and restore his family's honor. He now had enough weapons to reverse the entire game against those who had been hiding in the shadows, and he knew that the real hunt had finally begun. While Salvatore held in his hands the file that could overturn everything, somewhere else, another person was enduring the greatest inner struggle of his life. Aaron, the young accountant whom Ashford had forced into helping fabricate the false financial records, hadn't enjoyed a single peaceful night of sleep since he had been drawn into this tragedy. His conscience tormented him without mercy, because he understood that what he had done was destroying an innocent elderly woman, and worse still, those lies were being used against the very household where a young woman had treated him with a kindness he had never received from anyone before. He had been driven into a corner by his desperation to find money for his younger sister's medical treatment, and Ashford had exploited that weakness to turn him into a piece on his board. But whenever Aaron closed his eyes, Rosa's image appeared in his mind, the pregnant young woman who had patiently sat beside him and taught him how to care for his sister, the woman who had given him hope and warmth without asking for anything in return. He remembered the sincerity in her eyes when she said that what she had done was nothing remarkable, that anyone in her position would have done the same, and the contrast between her selfless goodness and the crime he was helping commit made his heart twist with pain. He realized that if he remained silent, if he continued following Ashford's plan, then the young woman who had brought light into his darkest days, along with the old woman she loved, would be driven into ruin, and he would never be able to forgive himself. That inner struggle finally led him to a decision, and Aaron understood that no matter how great the price might be, he couldn't continue living inside this lie. At the most critical moment, when Ashford was preparing to deliver the final blow that would force Salvatore into a corner and drive the investor away, Aaron quietly went to see Salvatore. He appeared with a face pale from fear, but his eyes carried the determination of a man who had chosen to stand on the side of what was right. "There's something I need to confess to you," he said, his voice trembling. "And I know doing this may cost me everything, perhaps even place my life in danger, but I can't remain silent any longer." He revealed the entire truth, explaining that he had been forced to create the fraudulent records, and that everything had been arranged by Ashford to frame the old woman and sabotage Salvatore's agreement. But Aaron hadn't come empty-handed, because throughout the time he had been compelled to work in the shadows. With the sharp instincts of a man trained to examine accounts, he had secretly preserved every piece of evidence connected to the manipulation, the original documents, the instructions, and the trails that clearly revealed who had been directing the entire conspiracy from behind the scenes. He handed everything he possessed to Salvatore, and as he did, he said in a choked voice that he wasn't doing this to beg for mercy for himself, but because of a young woman named Rosa. "She helped me when I had nothing left," he said. "She gave my sister and me a kindness we didn't deserve, and I can't allow her to suffer because of my crimes." Salvatore listened in silence, and an emotion he couldn't quite name rose within him, because he realized that the small act of kindness Rosa had planted without a second thought, the gesture she had believed to be insignificant, had now become the most powerful weapon of all, something that had changed a man's heart and delivered the final piece he needed to complete the picture of the truth. He looked at Aaron, and instead of his usual coldness, there was understanding in his eyes. "The courage you've shown today has saved more people than you realize," he said, "and you won't regret choosing to stand with the truth." Now, with the evidence from his mother's safe deposit box, together with Aaron's testimony and documents, Salvatore possessed everything he needed. At last, the scales of justice had shifted completely in his favor, ready for judgment to fall upon those who had caused so much suffering. With all the evidence securely in his hands, Salvatore didn't act rashly or violently. because he understood that the most fitting revenge against men like Ashford wasn't bloodshed, but stripping them of the very things they valued above all else, their power and their reputation. He arranged every detail with the precision of a chess player who already knew he had won, and he chose the exact moment to deliver the final blow. First, he went to Halloran and laid the complete truth before him. The documents from his mother's safe deposit box, together with Aaron's testimony and evidence, exposing every part of the filthy conspiracy that had been created to destroy their agreement. After examining everything, Halloran not only restored his trust in Salvatore, but also expressed admiration for the way he had confronted adversity, and the important deal that had once seemed destined to collapse was now signed on firmer ground than ever before. But that was only the beginning. Salvatore called a meeting and arranged for Ashford, Camille, and Patrick Doyle to be present, so that everyone who had taken part in the conspiracy would be forced to face their downfall together. When Ashford entered with his usual confidence, he had no idea that he was walking directly into a trap set by the very man he had considered his prey. Salvatore sat waiting, calm and commanding, then placed each piece of evidence upon the table one by one, exposing the entire plan to seize his empire, the falsified records, the bribery and coercion, and the alliance with the man responsible for the tragedy inflicted upon his mother. Ashford's self-satisfied expression gradually changed, shifting from surprise to panic as he realized that every move he had made had been completely uncovered. "I've spent my entire life learning how to make my enemies destroy themselves," Salvatore said in his low, chilling voice. "And you, Mr. Ashford, taught me that the most dangerous weapon isn't a fist, but the truth." He informed Ashford that the complete record of his illegal activities, not only those connected to this scheme, but also the other hidden dealings Salvatore's men had uncovered, would be handed over to the authorities and the press. Within a short time, Roland Ashford's celebrated name in the financial world collapsed like a castle made of sand. His partners turned their backs on him, his deals disintegrated, and the empire he had believed untouchable was stripped away piece by piece, leaving him disgraced and with nothing. As for Patrick Doyle, the man who had evaded justice for so many years, the undeniable evidence found in the safe deposit box of the very woman he had harmed finally dragged him into the light of the law. He was forced to answer for every crime he had committed, with nowhere left to hide and no one left to protect him. Amid all that ruin, Camille received a bitter ending of her own when her crimes were exposed. When her role in the plot against an innocent old woman was brought into the open, the glittering world of high society she had sacrificed everything to enter immediately turned its back on her. The wealthy friends who had once surrounded her now avoided her as though she carried a disease. Doors that had once opened wide slammed shut, and the flawless reputation she had worked so hard to create dissolved into nothing. Salvatore looked at the woman who had once been his fiancée, and he didn't need to speak a single cruel word, because the collapse of her own life was already the harshest punishment she could receive. The marriage between the two families naturally came to an end, and Camille left the mansion in humiliation, carrying with her the price of her greed and cruelty. When everything was finally over, when all those who had caused such suffering had faced the consequences of their actions, Salvatore stood alone beside the window and looked out over the city. For the first time in many years, his chest felt light, because he knew he had protected the people he loved without staining his hands with blood, using only the power of truth and justice. When the storms had passed and true peace finally returned to the mansion beside Lake Michigan, Salvatore found himself facing the greatest decision of his life, one he had never before dared to imagine. As he watched his mother growing stronger with each passing day and saw Rosa tenderly cradling her newborn child, he realized that the underworld empire he had sacrificed his youth to build had never given him the peace he now possessed. He understood that if he truly wanted to become the son his mother had always hoped he would be, and the protector of the small family that had newly formed around him, he would have to leave the darkness behind once and for all, and that was exactly what he did. Step by step, he transformed his entire empire into transparent and legitimate businesses, severed every tie to his shadowed past, and turned everything that had once been built through fear into something founded upon dignity and respect. It wasn't an easy road, but each time he looked into the baby's clear and innocent eyes, he found the strength to continue, because he wanted to give that little child a world far better than the one in which he had grown up. Maggie, now restored to health, became the heart of the household, the gentle grandmother who always sat beside the fireplace telling fairy tales to the children. Among those who often gathered around her was Frankie, the young son of the family's loyal housekeeper, a bright and kind-hearted boy who eagerly came running whenever Maggie began a new story, his eyes wide with wonder as he listened, and his laughter ringing brightly whenever the tale reached a happy ending. The boy's laughter, the newborn baby's soft babbling, Maggie's warm storytelling voice, and Rosa's gentle presence transformed the mansion that had once been so cold into a true home filled with warmth. 3 people who had once been rejected by life, an abandoned elderly woman, a young mother who had been cast aside, and a man who had lived alone behind walls of power, had now found one another, and together with that little child, they became a family in the truest sense. A family bound not by blood, but by sincere love and the choice to remain beside one another, to honor the years of suffering his mother had endured, and to ensure that kindness would continue spreading beyond the walls of their home. Salvatore built a residence for elderly people who had been abandoned by their children, lonely souls with nowhere to turn, just as his mother had once been. He named it after Maggie as a tribute to the woman who had taught him the meaning of unconditional love. Their story reminds us of something simple yet profound, that sometimes one small act of kindness toward a stranger can change an entire life. That goodness offered without any expectation of reward possesses the greatest power to save, and that a true family isn't always defined by blood, but by the people who are willing to stop for one another when the rest of the world turns away. Power and money can build towering walls and strong gates, but only love can warm a heart that has grown cold and help a lost soul find the road home. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it with the people you love, so that together we can listen to more meaningful stories each day. How do you feel about the journeys of Rosa, Maggie, and Salvatore? Which part of their story moved you most deeply? Please leave a comment and share the feelings that come from the deepest place in your heart, because we're always grateful to hear what you have to say. May everyone listening to this story be blessed with abundant health, a joyful and peaceful life, and love filling every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the stories still to come.